Hey guys, we are back and we are going to continue our lessons with Hansel and Gretel. As we know, Hansel and Gretel is a fairy tale and we are going to continue talking about Hansel and Gretel today. And we're actually going to read another version of Hansel and Gretel. But before we do that, we are going to review our learning target and then our vocabulary words that we talked about yesterday. Okay, so back behind me is the learning target and it says, I can summarize stories to include important details, character traits, and comparisons between two texts. So the last part of our learning target is what we're going to be focusing on today. So yesterday we went over some vocabulary words. It's always important when you're reading a text to look for those unknown words. Some of the words you may have known, but then there may be some that, I don't know what that word is. So you have to use your context clues and you have to use your text to help you understand what the word may mean. We went back and we looked at parts of the story to see where the author used those vocabulary words. So let's do a quick review before we jump into our lesson for today. So the first one on the list up here is scarcely, or you could say scarce. And when you refer to something as scarce, it means a small amount, okay? So in the story, the family had a small amount of food left. So their cabinets were scarce, okay? So our second vocabulary word we talked about is anxious. And when you are anxious, you are afraid or nervous about what might happen, okay? And so the father in the story was afraid. He was anxious about what was going to happen to his family because they had such little amount of food. Our third vocabulary word, and this is a vocabulary word we had last week too, but it is fetch. And we're probably all familiar with fetch with playing with a dog, but fetch means to go after and bring something back, okay? And the parents didn't come back and fetch their children. They didn't go and get them and bring them back when they led them into the woods. Next, we have devouring, and the children were very, very hungry after spending a few days in the forest without eating. So when they came upon the house of the little old lady, they started devouring the sweets that were on the house. So devouring is to eat quickly in a way to show you are very hungry. We have two more. The next one is cauldron. And a cauldron is a big pot. It doesn't have to be black, but a lot of times we think of it as a big black pot. And the little lady was using a cauldron to boil her water. And then last is kneading. And kneading is when you prepare dough with your hands. So you have to prepare your dough by moving the dough back and forth in your hands. And that is kneading. A lot of time we think of kneading when we're preparing bread. Okay, so there's a quick review of your vocabulary words. Yesterday you had to write in your write about reading notebooks or on the paper your teacher provided you a response to why you think it was important that the rocks glistened, the pebbles glistened. And I'm thinking that a lot of you probably said because it allowed the children to find their way back home. Because when something glistens, it's like a light, and the moon was able to help those pebbles glisten, and they were able to find their way back to their home. So I'm sure a lot of you, that's what you wrote, and if you did, good job. All right, so we're going to jump in our lesson for today. So we're going to read another version of the traditional fairy tale Hansel and Gretel. Now the traditional one was the one we read on Monday. Today is the one that's the fractured fairy tale. So when you think of a fractured fairy tale, it's a fairy tale that kind of changes. It changes from the traditional, okay? And so here's the story you're gonna listen to today. And the title is Trust Me, Hansel and Gretel Are Sweet. Now, especially if you're in my class, you're probably thinking, oh, I know who's telling the story now, because we've read several fractured fairy tales like this. But the witch or the little old lady in the traditional story is going to be the one who's telling the story in this one. So right now we're already seeing a difference because we're going to be comparing these two stories today. You're already seeing a difference. In the traditional fairy tale, she's referred to as the little old lady. In this fairy tale, she's referred to as the witch. Okay? So keep that in your minds. Store that for later. All right, so let's get busy reading this story. So, trust me, Hansel and Gretel are sweet, and this is by Nancy Lowen. Yes, I'm the witch from the Hansel and Gretel story, and yes, I live in a house made of gingerbread. But I most certainly did not tumble into the flames of my own oven. I mean, look at me. I'm alive. And never would I think of eating Hansel and Gretel. It's time I set the record straight. Gather around, but please, no nibbling on the house. I always knew I was different. While the other little witches were learning to make potions and cast spells, I was playing with my food. I molded mashed potatoes into polar bears. I wove noodles into wall hangings. As I grew up, my projects got bigger and better. I was a food artist. I made beds out of marshmallows and floors out of rock candy. Eventually, I built my own cottage, my masterpiece. A dirty spell kept the rain off my house, but I couldn't cast a spell strong enough to keep the birds away. So I got a pile of children's clothes from lost and found boxes and put up scarecrows. I suppose that's what started the rumor that I ate children. The scarecrows did the trick, except for one crow who wasn't the least bit scared. I called him Thorn. Every day I had to patch the messes he'd make. It was an ongoing battle. Not long ago, I was in back doing touch-up work when I heard children's voices. A shutter snapped, a window shattered. Little hooligans were eating my house. I ran around to the front. "Stop that this instant!" I yelled. "This is private property." The children, a boy and a girl, stared at me in horror. "We're sorry," said the girl, "but we are so hungry." "Please don't eat us," the boy begged. I could see that the children weren't doing well, so I invited them in for something to eat. Did you hear something similar so far? Their names were Hansel and Gretel. Between bites, they told me quite a story. "Our stepmother wanted to get rid of us," Gretel said. "She said there wasn't enough food for us, but just wanted it all to herself. She made Dad leave us in the forest twice. She was hoping we'd get lost," said Hansel. "The first time we made a trail with white pebbles and followed it back home. The next time we made a trail with breadcrumbs." Gretel continued, "But let me guess," I said. "The birds ate the crumbs, right?" The kids nodded. "Of course," I said, "they could live with me. Where else would they go?" Hansel and Gretel and I got along beautifully. I taught them about food art. They helped me with chores and kept an eye on that horrible bird. Hansel was a natural artist. He made a wonderful sculpture of himself out of sponge cake and fruit snacks. Sometimes I teased him by talking to it. "Oh, Hansel, I want to gobble you up," I'd say. Life was sweet. I didn't even have to worry about Thorn anymore. One day, he just disappeared. But you know, it was too good to be true. A bird like that never gives up. A few weeks later, the kids and I were baking pies. Suddenly, Thorn landed on my window box and began pecking away. Then a woman's voice called, "Yoo-hoo! Is anyone home?" Hansel and Gretel turned as white as powdered sugar. Their wicked stepmother. Yes, the stepmother and Thorn were working together. They wanted the kids and me out of the picture so they could eat my house. Well, that was not going to happen. I flung open the door. "Now look here," I began, but the woman pushed past me. "Darling children, you're alive!" she exclaimed. "Run for it!" I told Hansel and Gretel. I grabbed a pie and was about to throw it in the stepmother's face when she opened the oven door and shoved me in. I know this is a very scary part of the story. If you need to take a few minutes to deep breaths, go ahead. So there I was, hollering and pounding on the oven door. But then I realized something. The flames weren't burning me. In fact, they tickled. My dear old oven, my true and best friend, would never harm me. When the stepmother checked to see if I'd burned to crisp, out I popped. Not a toasted hair on my head. She ran away, shrieking. Thorn flew close behind. They were never heard of, ever again. Now, life is even sweeter. Hansel and Gretel still live with me. So does their dad. A nice fellow, now that his wicked wife isn't around. With all these extra helping hands, I've made plans to expand. A guest house, a playroom, maybe even a swimming pool. We'll have a party when it's all finished. You will most certainly be invited. So, that is the fractured fairy tale for Hansel and Gretel. There were some similarities in the story, so when you compare and you contrast, you can think of some things that they had in common, but there were also a lot of major differences. So this is what your activity is going to be today. So if you turn and look back here, I need to fix it really quick. You will see day 3 at the top because this is what day we're on. And so you're going to set up your papers just like this. I'll move it a little bit closer. And at the top it says comparing the stories, and that's exactly what you're going to do. A lot of times we use a Venn diagram to do this, but today we're going to use kind of a T-chart. This is kind of similar to a T-chart. And at the top you're going to see title number 1, title number 2. And so you'll write the first title, which is the first story we read, Hansel and Gretel. And then under title number 2, you'll write the new title that we read just a few minutes ago. Trust me, Hansel and Gretel are sweet. So here's what your task is going to be. You're going to list the characters in the first story, list the characters in the second story. Remember their names. Remember what they were referred to. I'm going to give you a little hint. Think of the old woman. She wasn't referred to as the old woman in the second story. And think of the mother in the first story. She was not called mother in the second story. Okay? So really think about those character names. Setting. So remember, the setting is where the story takes place. So you're going to tell me the setting in both stories. The problem. There was a problem in both stories. What was it? And then how did the problem get solved? The solution. And then finally, how did the story end? Both stories had big differences in how it ended. Okay? So once you're done with that, that's your reading assignment for today. Okay? I enjoyed reading that fractured fairy tale with you. Tomorrow, since this is a short week, we're going to review for your comprehension check over the first story, Hansel and Gretel. Okay? Enjoy your work today, boys and girls.